Early in January of this year, I accompanied my grandfather down to eastern Tennessee to the small rural town he grew up in. After Hurricane Helene, my grandfather wanted to see how his childhood home, which is about a 20-minute drive east of the town, had fared during the devastating weather. While on this trip, however, my grandfather shared with me a lot of stories about his childhood, growing up in Appalachia, and a lot of other things. I learned a lot about him that I had simply never known. One story in particular, however, was genuinely scary, and I had trouble sleeping the night after hearing it. I still occasionally have weird nightmares about it. I will recount that story below. In February of 1954, a few weeks before my grandfather turned 12, his family's little farm had been experiencing some attacks on their animals, mainly the chickens. In the weeks before, they had lost 7 or 8 chickens from their flock of 30 or so. They had a small property, an acre or two, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically near a place called Hall Mountain. One night during a fairly heavy snowstorm, my grandfather's family was awoken to the sounds of chickens screaming and flocking around in their coops some 70 or so yards away from the house. My grandfather and his dad, Paul, immediately jumped into their boots and coats and ran outside to confront what they believed would be some coyotes. As they ran outside the back door, my great-grandfather with his rifle and my grandfather with a pellet gun both stopped dead in their tracks as they saw what my grandfather described the nastiest, most foul-looking human-type creature you could possibly imagine. A light on the barn illuminated the creature, and my grandfather said that it was almost bare naked, save for what looked to be a bear pelt draped around its shoulders, and had a dead chicken in its mouth. Paul snapped out of his shock and fired a few rounds at the creature. He nicked it once in the upper thigh as it ran across a field, initially on 2 legs, before dropping down to all 4s and disappearing into the woods. My grandfather and his father stood there in shock. They made sure the rest of the chickens and the other animals were all right before my grandfather was told to go back inside, check on his mom and sister, and go back to bed. Apparently, Paul stayed outside for a few hours, pacing back and forth on the porch, waiting for that creature to come back. My grandfather said he hardly slept the rest of that night, and when he got up the next morning, he saw his father in the living room on their phone. As he was eating breakfast, his father came into the dining room, whispered something to his wife, and sat at the table. When my grandfather finished eating breakfast, his mother left the room and his father cleared his throat and started talking. "I was on the phone with your uncle. He'll be here this afternoon with your cousin. We're going to follow the blood trail that was left behind by whatever creature we saw last night. It went down into the holler on the mountain." My grandfather said he just shook his head quietly and didn't really speak the rest of the morning. By 12:30, himself, his father, his Uncle Peter, and his cousin Samuel were all walking northwest into the woods following the bloody trail left behind the previous night. My grandfather said it felt like an hour or so must have passed before anyone spoke. His Uncle Peter, who was much more of a hunter than Paul, stopped everyone and pointed at something slightly up the trail. The tracks led up to a spot in the snow that was just soaked in blood. My grandfather said it looked like something had just keeled over and died. What really shocked them as they approached it, however, was how it appeared like whatever had laid there had been dragged deeper into the woods. They began following the new trail that had been dragged through the snow and began noticing multiple sets of tracks which were made by bare human feet alongside the dragged trail. It was at this moment when my grandfather noticed his father switching the safety on his rifle to off. They trekked alongside the trail a little farther until they reached a small, frozen stream. On the other side of the stream, tucked under a massive cliff overhang, was a cave entrance. My grandfather said it was about 20 feet across and maybe 6.5 feet tall at its tallest. The bloody drag marks in the multiple tracks led right across the stream and into the cave. Paul and Peter told the boys to wait behind a rock, and if they didn't shout back that they were okay in 5 minutes, to run back home and call the police. They walked over the river and stood at the cave entrance before shining a light into it and slowly walking in. My grandfather said that about 4 minutes passed before they heard his uncle's voice, but that it seemed like an eternity. They saw his Uncle Peter come out, and his father shortly followed. My grandfather said that they were both pale as ghosts, and that they hardly spoke on the long hike back. My grandfather and Samuel begged Paul and Peter to tell them what they saw, but the 2 men wouldn't budge and said that they would all talk later. They all returned to my grandfather's house around 3 o'clock that afternoon, and his Uncle Peter and Samuel immediately got in their truck and left without saying a word. My grandfather and his father walked in through the back door into the kitchen where his mother was waiting anxiously. Paul hugged her and whispered something to her. She nodded and went into a separate room. Paul sat down at a desk in the kitchen and motioned for my grandfather to bring a chair over and sit. My grandfather did so, and this is what Paul told him, apparently verbatim. "Your uncle and I went into that cave, and we saw people. They aren't people like you or me or anyone you know. They're very different. They live deep in the woods and don't leave, hardly ever. They are almost like animals, I suppose. You might call them wild. It seems like they've lived deep in those woods and hollers longer than anyone has ever been here. We saw the person I shot last night. He must have died. His people were giving him a burial, I believe. They saw us and they acknowledged us. They didn't seem mad, but I know we aren't welcome back there. Tommy, do not ever go across that creek. Everything over it is theirs, and we will leave them to it. My grandfather said that was the only time his father ever spoke of what he saw in that cave. His father never went back, and neither did he. I know the whole feral people concept is up in the air, and most people don't believe it, which I completely understand. Honestly, I don't think I do either. But the way my grandfather spoke about it, the sincerity with which he spoke, and the tone of his voice during certain parts of the story, I fully believe he was being honest. He truly saw his father fatally shoot a feral human, and his father and his uncle truly saw a small feral community living in a cave deep in the Appalachian hills.